Every night, strange things happen at the grocery store I work at. No worker experiences the same thing as another, and the experiences get more and more frightening the further into your shift you go. The last hour of most of my nights consist of me anxiously checking the clock and being scared shitless. Applying for this job was my last shot in the dark before I completely gave up on life. I dropped out of high school, and my younger years were filled with bad choices that eventually landed me in prison. Because of this, no job wanted to hire me. Being used to my applications getting rejected, I was surprised when this job called me back for an interview. The interview wasn't even an interview, with questions like, "You're cool with working overnight?" and "What would you like to do here?" I knew that I already had the job. At the end of the interview, my future manager, Dave, said, "Strange things happen here." "Like what?" I asked, furrowing my brow. "Hard to explain. You'll get used to it, though." He smirked as he handed the paperwork over for me to sign. Big red flag there, I know. But I was desperate for work, and so I reluctantly accepted the job. Some nights, the events that take place here really are just strange. Other nights, they are downright terrifying. Last night was one of the latter. My shift started off like any other. I clocked in and met up with Dave to see what my tasks would be for the night. He gave me the unfortunate news that I would be working front end, where I would stay by the door to greet the few nightly customers we got and check them out when they were ready. The rest of my coworkers would be in the back room, unloading the truck and preparing carts of freight to be stocked by the morning shift. I would be the only person on the sales floor. Basically, I was going to be bored and alone for 8 hours. Or so I thought. I made my way to the front end, dreading the long night ahead of me, and took a seat in the chair that was ahead of the 2 front enter and exit doors. 30 minutes into my shift, my night was going smoothly. I greeted and checked out a few customers, and I could tell that it was slowing down. A little before the first hour of my shift ended, another customer walked in through the first set of sliding glass doors, but stopped before walking through the second and stared at me from behind the glass. A middle-aged woman, so pale in complexion that her veins bulged out of her translucent skin. Her eyes such a dark shade of brown that they appeared black, and lacerations and contusions lined the left side of her face. At first I thought that she was just another one of the local strung-out crackheads that would occasionally visit the store. I wish that theory was right. For the last remaining minutes of the first hour of my shift, all she did was stare at me with this blank, expressionless look on her face. As the clock struck 9, it was made clear to me that this was going to be the nightly, strange thing that I would have to get through. The digital clock that was on the wall next to the front doors changed to 9, and as it did, the pale woman snapped her body 90 degrees to her right. Mechanically, she marched over to the front enter door, letting the automatic glass door slide open. She snapped her body 90 degrees again, this time to her left as she did that same robotic, military-esque march through the front doors. With yet another 90-degree turn to her left, she walked towards the middle between the enter and exit signs and turned on her heel, facing me directly. The woman stared at me, unblinking. Although I knew that this was my nightly, in Dave's terms, strange thing, I couldn't help but feel terror and an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me as she gazed, devoid of any emotion. She stayed still, staring at me for the rest of the second hour of my shift. As soon as the time changed to 10, the woman swiveled her neck in the direction of the clock, keeping her gaze on me the entire time. Her neck turned at an inhuman angle before stopping suddenly. Her eyes, for the first time in an hour, left contact with mine, and she locked onto the clock on the wall. When she saw that the hour had changed, she showed her first sign of emotion. A small smirk formed on her face. She turned her neck back to me, and her eyes met mine once again. The hour went on, and her smirk began to form into a full, toothless smile. Her lips stretched from ear to ear so far that it pulled on the muscles of her face, making the lacerations on the left side split open further. Blood escaped her reopened wounds, running down her cheek and onto her jaw. She stayed like this, a small puddle of blood forming beneath her feet. 10 minutes before the clock struck 11, the woman took one step closer. At 10:59, the woman went down onto all fours and got in the same position that a sprinter would get into before starting a race. Her neck was snapped up, her eyes locked onto mine, her what seemed to be ebony eyes never leaving my gaze, her smile still attempting to stretch further. Beads of sweat formed on my brow, and my heart began to pound rapidly as my eyes darted from her to clock on the wall, anxiously waiting for the time to change. My eyes were on the clock as it changed to 11, and I had no chance to react to what happened next. The woman popped up from her position and sprinted at me with unnatural speed. The smile on her face was gone, replaced with a look of curiosity and determination. I had no time to react to what she was about to do, and so I cowered in fear, covering my face with my arms and tensing my entire body, and no impact happened. I heard her footsteps get centimeters away from me before she changed directions and ran past me. I peeked my eyes out from under my arms and slowly turned my head in her direction. I watched as she ran off, ducking into one of the aisles towards the back of the store. For most of the rest of the third hour of my shift, I sat in my chair, constantly checking my back to make sure the stranger wasn't creeping up on me. She didn't show herself at all until, "Hey!" I heard from behind me, a hard slap hitting my shoulder. I tensed, jumped out of my seat, and spun around. It was my boss, Dave. I breathed a sigh of relief. "Scared the fuck out of me, man." I groaned out, putting my hand over my heart. Dave looked at me with a surprised look on his face. His eyes were wide, his brow was furrowed, and his mouth hung open in shock. He put his hands up, letting me know he wasn't a threat. "Jesus Christ, dude, you look like shit. Go take your lunch. I'll cover for you up here." "Thanks." I nodded and breathed another sigh of relief. I was so thankful for the break that as I made my way to the back room, I wasn't even thinking about the woman that had been terrorizing me for the past 3 hours. That is, until I was halfway to the doors of the back room. Long, salt and pepper hair began to appear, and the woman's head emerged from the corner of the last aisle. Her hands covered her face like a parent playing peekaboo with a baby. I would have to walk right past her to get to the back door. I pressed on and noticed the stranger's head shaking violently. As I got closer, I saw why. The faint sound of the woman's giggles echoed louder with every single step I took. She was trying to keep her laughter in. Just as I was about to walk past her, the woman darted her hand out and grabbed my wrist, gripping it with incredible strength. I tried to yank it away, but her grip was too tight. "Run!" the woman screamed in a raspy, smoker-like tone. "Get the fuck off of me!" I yelled back. "Run!" The woman screamed one last time before releasing her grip from my wrists. I did just as she said. I sprinted all the way to the back room and into the break room as she cackled behind me. I collapsed into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs and buried my head into my arms on the table. I had completely lost my appetite at this point, so I set my alarm for 1 a.m. and went back into that position for my entire lunch break. I awoke to the annoying sound of my alarm and reluctantly opened my eyes and reached for my phone to turn it off. I was not looking forward to the rest of my shift. I stood up and stretched, preparing both my mind and my body for the rest of the hours ahead of me before walking to the time clock and punching back in. On my walk back up to the front of the store, the atmosphere was eerily calm. Dave walked towards me, holding his phone up to his ear. He covered the speaker and mouthed, "Going to lunch," to me, and patted me on the back as we passed each other. Although Dave could be annoying, everyone thought it was sweet that he would call his wife every time he went on break. With Dave going to lunch, it was back to being alone again for me. I got back to my chair at the front of the building. I was contemplating standing instead of sitting so I could be ready for anything, but I was still so tired from both my nap and the events leading up to my lunch that I decided to take a seat. I checked the clock on the wall. 1:08 a.m. I took in a deep breath and breathed out a "here we go" as I crossed my legs and rested my arm on the side of the chair, putting my hand against my face. I tapped on my temples and periodically checked the clock, patiently and anxiously waiting for the woman to arrive again. 1:36 a.m. The building was oddly quiet. I looked behind me, to the left and right of me, and nothing. If I hadn't worked there, I would have thought the place was abandoned. It looked like people should have been there, but the entire store was just a quiet, liminal space. Feeling creeped out by the setting I was in, I stared ahead at the front doors and tried to space myself out. Even with the store being silent, I didn't hear the woman approaching me from behind. "Boo!" she yelled, her lips pressed right up against my ear. I flinched hard and shot up out of my seat, spinning around to face the stranger. She threw her body back in laughter, cackling at the ceiling. Eventually, her laughter subsided, and her body fell back into normal position, and as it did, her hair fell over the side of her face, draping over her eyes in perfect, The Ring-like fashion. If I had anything to eat the hour prior, I'm sure it would have came back up at that exact moment. I was terrified. What does she want? I thought to myself. What does she want? The woman repeated my thought back to me. What the fuck? What the fuck? She repeated as she tilted her head slightly to the side and started taking slow steps towards me. I started backwalking, and because I was so focused on watching her, I didn't realize that I was backing myself against a wall. The back of my head collided with it with a solid thump. The collision startled me, and I took not even a second to look down to put my hand on my head to massage where the impact happened. When I looked back up at the woman, she was stopped in place, and we stared at each other for a moment. The standoff ended when she looked at the clock. My eyes followed and then went right back to her. It had just turned 2 a.m. The woman took 2 long strides forward, almost closing the distance between herself and I. She was in the middle of a 3rd step when I turned left on my heel and started running as fast as I could down the front end of the store. I heard her footsteps closely behind me. She was gaining on me. As I was sprinting, I took a quick glance behind my shoulder. The woman was right on my heels, reaching her arm out trying to grab me. Her fingers began to graze the back of my neck, her sharp nails poking into my skin as I tried to pick up my pace. My heart was pounding, ready to jump out of my chest as I inhaled short breaths, the back of my throat burning as I desperately tried to outrun the woman. Just as she closed the distance enough to grab the back of my neck, I made a sharp right turn into one of the aisles, breaking her grip. The woman wasn't expecting this, and her momentum carried her forward before she could react to my sudden change in direction. I was gasping for air, and although my lungs were begging for a break, I kept running. The sounds of the woman's pounding footsteps in the aisle next to me reverberated through my ears, and we both shot out of our respected aisles at the same time. The woman dove after me with her arms outstretched as I did a spin, narrowly avoiding her grasping claws. Her body hit the ground with a solid thud, and she let out a demonic-sounding growl. This was my only chance to put some distance between herself and I took full advantage of the opportunity. My body was exhausted at this point, and I knew that I couldn't keep this pace up for much longer. So I ran down aisle after aisle in search of a place to hide. Finally, I made it to the lawn and garden section, and I saw a stack of empty pallets jacked up and pressed against the wall. Pallets. Hide behind the pallets. I thought to myself. I looked all around me, making sure that the woman wouldn't see me, and I climbed behind them. There was barely enough room for me to fit, and although my legs immediately began to cramp up, it was my best shot at escaping the stranger. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. 3:04 a.m. I put my phone back in my pocket so the light from the screen wouldn't give my position away. I took a deep breath in and exhaled it. Last hour, I whispered underneath my breath. I was both anxious and excited about the last hour of my shift. Excited for my shift to finally end, and anxious to see what the woman had in store for me in the final moments of the night. I peeked out of the square holes in the pallets in search of the woman, but she was nowhere to be found. All I heard was the sounds of her distant, slow footsteps. no doubt that she was looking for me. The time passed on, and I began thinking that I had finally lost her. I peeked down at the time on my phone, 3:32 a.m. A feeling of relief washed over me. Only 28 minutes to go until this nightmare was over. As quickly as that relief washed over me, it was gone as the woman turned into the lawn and garden section. This time, she was holding a knife. That relief was quickly replaced with dread and fear. I put a hand over my mouth, trying to conceal the sounds of my shaky, anxious breaths. The woman did a quick glance around the aisle and, luckily for me, didn't try searching the area very hard. At least, I thought I was lucky. The lady turned around and began walking back out of the aisle when she paused. With her back turned to me, she growled my earlier thoughts out. "Pallets. Hide behind the pallets." She spun around, facing the pallets and me, and cocked her head to the side. "Pallets. Hide behind the pallets," she said again, slowly inching her way closer to me. She had those insane, wide eyes, the ones where you know the person is there, but not there at the same time. Her face got out of my view as she walked right up to the pallets, and all I saw was her lower body. She bent down, lowering herself more and more, peeking through each pallet until I came into her view. She made eye contact with me and stopped. Her eyes became wider, and a grin formed across her face. "There you are," she said in excitement as she gripped the knife tighter. I realized I had basically backed myself up against another wall by choosing this hiding spot, and I was not trying to stick around to be stabbing practice for this bitch. Remembering that the pallets were jacked up, I realized I could push them into her. With a deep breath, I counted to 3 in my head. 1 dot, 2 dots, 3 dots, the woman repeated after me. 1, 2. I used all of my strength to send the pallets barreling into her, and she screamed as the pallets knocked her onto her ass, and I took off past her. 3:51 a.m. I turned to look over my shoulder, and the woman was sprinting faster than I've ever seen towards me. She winded her arm back and threw the knife at my head. I dodged to the right, the sound of the knife whizzing past in my ear. I kept running, 3:56 a.m., just a little further until I made it to the backroom doors to clock out. The woman was nowhere behind me when all of the sudden, she appeared out of an aisle I was about to run past and grabbed at my throat. Luckily, my first instinct was to wind my arm back and punch her square in the face. My fist connected with her jaw, and I felt her bones crunch against my fist, and she collapsed to the ground. She was out cold. I continued running all the way to the back room, and I reached the time clock just as the time changed to 4 a.m. This nightmare was finally over. I clocked out and went back onto the sales floor. Although I knew that my nightly strange occurrence was over with, I still half expected to be jumped by the woman. I made it to my car and drove all the way back home in silence. I was still in shock from the night. This was by far the most terrifying thing that has happened to me at the store. I got home with work still on my mind, and so I sat down at my computer and Googled the name of the store. Article after article came up, and I scrolled through pages of titles with no meaning until I came across one that caught my eye. Woman murdered in redacted parking lot. Curious, I clicked on the article, and the face of the woman that had just terrorized me for 8 hours came up on the screen. She had been killed in the parking lot of the store I worked at, long before I had ever worked there. The article described how the woman was attacked, beaten, and slashed across the face, left laying in the parking lot until she succumbed to her wounds. Out of all the strange and horrifying things that I have experienced here, this is the first time that I had experienced a ghost. This felt like more than a ghost, though. This felt evil, a demonic presence. Nobody here has ever died from the nightly strange occurrences, but I know that if she had caught me, I wouldn't be here writing this right now. Although I am used to it by now, I worry about what I will have to go through tonight. The things that happen here are usually, for the most part, harmless, but now it seems as though working here may be dangerous. Nobody else will hire me, and so I am forced to continue on. If you don't hear back from me, well, you know what probably happened. Until next time, no sleep.